Okay. I don't actually expect anyone to join this, but I figured I would do a video on the biases of the mental health community against or for dissociative identity disorder. So I'm just gonna talk about that. But yeah, basically, whoa. Let's not step on that. Don't step on my computer. You're gonna do something. Okay. This is Mateo, by the way. Maybe. Talking about So, first of all, I would like to say that dissociative identity disorder has a lot of biases against it. More biases probably against it than for it. And I'm talking specifically about biases, not science, because science does thank you for going around. Science does prove it, so there's not really much to say there. But talking about how, like, talking about how regardless of it's still very against in or heavily how do I describe that? It's like even if someone believes that it's real, they're kind of sometimes iffy about diagnosing it versus every other diagnosis. They just diagnose it based off the symptoms and the what's there. But on the other hand, dissociative identity disorder, it's not like that. You get a lot of people being more like, well, let's diagnose every other thing that it could be rather than dissociative identity disorder. So how you diagnose people is pretty, standard, I feel like. You do an evaluation, whether it's a quick 2-hour one or an evaluation done over time. Um, and based off the symptoms that are either presented or reported, you would diagnose um, something typically, unless there's really nothing to diagnose. But usually people don't go to a psychiatrist or a psychologist unless there is something to diagnose. So, like, for example, if someone comes in and is reporting hearing voices, having hallucinations, um, having delusions and stuff like that, it's probably very likely that schizophrenia will be kind of put on the table and considered, because that is what is being presented and um, that's what's being reported. Versus dissociative identity disorder, um, if you come in and you're like, hey, I have amnesia, I am experiencing gaps in memory or time, I dissociate a lot, I just a lot of the standard symptoms of DID, or even if it's not reported, but seeing, like, switches or personality differences, memory differences, etc. Um, Most people aren't going to be like, oh, yeah, I think you have dissociative identity disorder. It's probably going to be something more like, well, let's diagnose everything else before we officially diagnose dissociative identity disorder, because we don't want to misdiagnose dissociative identity disorder, heaven forbid, but we can misdiagnose everything else in place of dissociative identity disorder. And I think this, when you put it, oh, hi. When you put it into that perspective, there's not, let's not go into the box. How about that? There's not, there's not much of an excuse. I know that a lot of people say, well, there's controversies and stuff like that. The controversies are because of biases, and I think it's important for people to recognize their biases and fix them. And I think in this case, there is a definite bias that should be considered. A lot of people are they're more worried about the biases towards DID. So, like, someone believes DID is real and then automatically they're overdiagnosing DID, which I will say, I'm not going to go against that and say that doesn't happen, because it happens in almost every disorder. I've met people who specialize in bipolar and overdiagnose bipolar because of it. It's not uncommon. And I think it's important more for people to realize that this happens in almost every disorder, and therefore, and it's not, okay, it's not okay to be like, well, I have, this extreme knowledge in this one disorder, and therefore everything that is presented to me now sounds like this one disorder. That's obviously not okay. And there's people who specialize in dissociative identity disorder who are probably like that. But there's people who are like that in almost every disorder. So it's not uncommon. However, the thing is that in comparison to other disorders, the biases against DID don't happen in other disorders at least half as much as it does with dissociative identity disorder, where basically, you refuse to diagnose it, basically, even though it's presented. the symptoms are presented, the experiences are presented, etc. So I think that should. Why do you keep coming up here? I think that should be talked about more. And I think the stigma, I do believe, tends to come from a lot of different things. A lot of people don't believe that dissociative identity disorder exists, because, I mean, for a lot of different reasons. Either that there's not enough science behind it, which there is, or it's real, but it's overdiagnosed. There's a lot of reasons as to why people don't believe dissociative identity disorder is real, most of which can be disproven. Some are just kind of idiotic, I will admit. I've heard some pretty interesting reasons out there as to why dissociative identity disorder isn't real. But it is. It's in the DSM-5, which is the diagnostic manual for disorders, mental disorders. So it's real. There's enough. If there's enough proof for it to be in the DSM, um, people aren't just going to put random things in the DSM. That's not how that works. The DSM is made by a collection of multiple different people, all with different biases and all with different opinions, and all of them can come to a consensus about these disorders and decide what they are and what the criteria for them would be. And they've done that with dissociative identity disorder. And there were people who worked in making the DSM who did not believe that it was real, but there was too much proof to go against it. So it is a real disorder. There are brain scans where different parts of the brain have been kind of what's the word I'm looking for? Different parts of the brain have been activated, or have been functioning, whereas in a person without DID, all of those functions, parts of the brains would be functioning together. So I kind of like to put it as like with DID, the brain is no longer coexisting together. Like it's not coexisting with itself, versus a person without dissociative identity disorder, it's coexisting with itself. It's functioning with itself, but with dissociative identity disorder, it's functioning in separate states of itself. There's proof for that. There's obvious proof that people with dissociative identity disorder at least have PTSD. So based off like brain scans, MRIs and stuff like that. So really dissociated. Um, yeah. Um, Talking more about the concern of people overdiagnosing dissociative identity disorder. Um, for one, with any disorder, that's always, it's always a risk. There's always going to be some asshole in this world that is just hyper obsessive over like one disorder and wants to diagnose it or like tries to fit everyone into that disorder. Um, and having this constant fear of it isn't going to help anything. I think spreading more awareness on it and kind of bringing it into reality and perspective would be kind of what would help lessen the amount of people who are kind of obsessive over it. You tend to not be as obsessive over things that are well known. So, I think everything that people have concerns about, most of the issues, if not all of the issues, can be solved by just bringing more awareness to the disorder. I think also a lot of people, in kind of talking about bringing awareness, a lot of people tend to talk about how DID is debilitating and it's impossible to function with, and people with DID wouldn't be openly talking about it and stuff like that. Um, I would heavily disagree. For one, DID is designed to help you function. So, because the idea of having DID is that you were trying to survive something that wasn't survivable. And so your brain made the situation survivable by compartmentalizing what happened to you so that there's parts of your brain that can still function. Um, so this whole kind of idea of people with DID can't function is entirely bullshit because that goes against literally every mechanism and every scientific explanation for how people survive. Um, so um, basically how that works, going into it more, is that the brain compartmentalizes certain, so like let's say you go through a trauma. um the brain takes that experience and compartmentalizes it into a different state of consciousness so that there's still a state of consciousness that can function without the awareness of it, and then the other state of consciousness holds that. And so there's always going to be at least one alter in the system, if not more, that can function. Um, because the design is that at least one of the alters, at least one state of consciousness, is unaware and can function outside of the reality of what happened to them. Um, so to say that people with DID are completely unfunctionable is impossible and it's inaccurate, because that's not how it's designed. There's obviously things that are debilitating. Yeah. I don't know if that's the right word. Um, in in DID, like for example, having flashbacks is Yeah, I was right. Having flashbacks is hard. It's not fun. It brings a lot of issues both physically and mentally. It can kind of stall you for a minute or two or quite a few minutes, make things harder to function in the moment. And um, what was I saying? Oh yeah. But um, um, if mental disorders weren't hard, they wouldn't be mental disorders. So there's obviously aspects of DID that are difficult and will be difficult. And some people might have a harder time with it than others, and that's okay. Some people might have an easier time than others. Um, it really depends on the person, how it was handled, how your brain and your system handles it, and then also kind of what happened. Getting a headache. So to say that people with DID can't bring awareness to their own disorder because it's too hard for them is not accurate. There are certain people who can do it. Like, for example, you know, this disorder isn't fun for any of us. And we have a hard time with it. And like just yesterday, I had to completely leave work because I was having such a bad PTSD attack. Um, and yeah, it's hard. Um, and it's not fun and it's not easy. Like right now, I'm dissociated as fuck. I kind of wish I wasn't doing this, but at the same time, I kind of want to stay grounded. So, and I also want to talk about this. But dissociation is making it 10 times harder than it needs to be. Um, and it's not fun having people kind of not be able to rely on you because you can't remember or plans change. My plans change constantly throughout the day because I can't stay consistent because there's so many it's so hard to describe. Either something came up that I forgot to do and now I need to do it, or a different alter wants to do something else, or someone else fronts and completely does something different. Um, and it's or depression or PTSD makes it hard to do stuff. And it's not fun, but I think talking about it kind of helps sometimes, at least for us. Just she's talking in her sleep again. Just talking about our experiences, um, and stuff, and problems within the DID community or the mental health community. It helps to be heard. And it helps to get it off your chest by talking. And that's why talk therapy is a thing. Um, and if people want to listen in the process, then I think that is also helpful. It's just, yes, there are a lot of risks putting yourself on the internet and being open. And there's a lot of things that could go wrong. But if the outcome is a greater good than what happens in the process of the outcome, I think that the world just completely moved. Um, I think that that's worth doing something, and I know that trying to spread more awareness about DID is needed. And I'm not forcing myself to do anything that I don't want to do. Um, I think a lot of people tend to silence survivors by saying that they can't do something because they're too broken. And I don't think that that's true. Um, People who have suffered already don't they don't need to be fit in a box of always going to be suffering for something they couldn't even control. I think that's really all I wanted to say. Um, so yeah, that's that. Thanks for watching if you did.